I want to add to this conversation because I feel that I have something to say that has not been said yet. The language used to dismiss this film in 2026 is the same language that was used to dismiss the novel in 1847, and I wanted to understand why. When I was watching the Oscars the other night, Autumn Durald-Arkapaw won Best Cinematography. She is the first woman to ever win that award. In 97 years, throughout the entire history of the Academy, not a single woman has taken it home. And when she got up on that stage, she asked every woman in the Dolby Theater to stand up because she said that she would not be there without them. And in that moment, it made me cry because it meant something to me. It meant something because women are still so new to being accepted in the art world and film industry. So it inspired me to do some research and write down my thoughts. I surprised myself making this. I will never look at another adaptation the same way again, and I don't think that you will either. My first introduction to Wuthering Heights was when I was around 10 years old, and I watched the 1939 adaptation starring Meryl Oberon and Laurence Olivier with my parents. I remember trying not to cry in front of my mom because I hated showing my emotions in public. And when I later read the novel for the first time in high school, I was so disappointed that the Heathcliff in the book didn't match the Heathcliff that lived in my imagination, which was this dashing, romantic, Shakespearean Laurence Olivier. Linda Hutchins' theory of adaptation dismantles the entire language of fidelity criticism. In its place, she considers a view that considers adaptation as a valid creative act. She listed the words that critics often use to describe adaptations, like tampering, interference, violation, betrayal, deformation, perversion, infidelity, and desecration. And those are not aesthetic terms. They are literally the vocabulary of sexual violence and religious sacrilege. Hutchins connects the vocabulary to two major ideas in Western culture: iconophobia, which is the belief that images are less valuable than words, and logophilia, which is this almost religious respect for written texts. In this view, the novel is seen as scripture, while the film is merely a copy, and the adapter is viewed as a heretic. This establishes a systemic hierarchy of interpretation that values words over images and the intellect over a sensory experience. Following this reasoning leads to a cultural view that evaluates the male literary tradition over the female visual one. If adaptations are such inferior and secondary creations, why then are they so popular in our culture and actually increasing steadily in numbers? When they say desecration, they may mean it, but they haven't stopped to ask themselves why they thought of that word. It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. That quote is by Oscar Wilde. Susan Sontag placed it at the beginning of her 1964 essay Against Interpretation. And it belongs in this video essay because it reframes every accusation of shallowness that has ever been thrown at a woman who dares to make art. Sontag makes an observation that I think is essential to understanding what happened to Fennell's film. She writes that interpretation is not some timeless, neutral good. It has to be evaluated historically. In some contexts, interpretation liberates. It helps you escape the dead past, see something that you maybe couldn't see before. But in other contexts, interpretation is reactionary. She describes it as cowardly and stifling. It poisons our ability to actually experience the thing in front of us. We are living in the second context. We are drowning in interpretation. Every film that comes out is immediately metabolized into takes. Hot takes, cold takes, video essays, threads, ranking lists, podcast breakdowns of what it got right and what it got wrong. The work of art barely has time to reach your nervous system before someone is telling you what to think about it. And Sontag saw this coming 60 years ago. She said interpretation is not the compliment that mediocrity pays to genius. It is the modern way of understanding something, period. We don't know how to encounter art anymore without immediately asking what it means. And then she says something about cinema that kind of disturbed me, or at least disturbed my thinking patterns when it comes to it. She writes that cinema is the most alive, the most exciting, the most important of all art forms. And here's why. Because of the latitude it gives for making mistakes in it and still being good. That is the most generous definition of artistic freedom that I have ever encountered. And it is the exact opposite of what fidelity discourse does. The fidelity discourse says, you got it wrong, therefore the film fails. While Sontag says, a living art form is one where you can get things wrong and the work still has power. In this view, the mistakes do not cancel the overall achievement. That is what it means for an art form to be alive. She explains that cinema survived the interpreters for so long, partly by accident. Films were just movies, mass culture entertainment that was viewed as a passing fad, not an enduring art form. The people with minds, as she put it, left them alone. And because they were left alone, they got to breathe. They got to be experienced rather than decoded. And cinema has something the novel doesn't, a vocabulary of forms. You have camera movement and cutting and composition. There is always something other than the content to hold on to. There is always the visual surface. And here is where Sontag asks the question that I have been trying to ask. What would criticism look like that served the work of the art instead of usurping its place? She answers it in her essay. What is needed is more attention to form, a descriptive vocabulary instead of a prescriptive one. And this is the phrase that I find the most important to retain. The best criticism would supply a really accurate, sharp, loving description of the appearance of a work of art. The best criticism loves the thing that it's looking at. The discourse has made it embarrassing to simply say, I sat in the theater and I watched the film and it reached me and I liked it. And you can't really do that without looking dumb, or you must not be a big enough fan of the novel to hate the movie. Sontag says transparence is the highest value in art and in criticism. Transparence means experiencing the luminousness of the thing in itself, things being what they are, and she warns that the sensory experience of art cannot be taken for granted anymore. We live in a culture of excess and overproduction. Our senses are dulled. The sheer volume of content has made us less capable of experiencing any single piece of it. Everything is scroll, swipe, next. So her prescription is to recover our senses. When you approach art or even life, to feel more, to see more, to hear more, squeezing the maximum amount of meaning from a work of art ruins the experience of the art itself. The aim of all commentary on art should be to make works of art more real to us, not necessarily to explain what they mean, but to show that they are what they are. She closes her essay with this. In place of hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art. When I was in the cinema watching the film, and the screen was black in the beginning, and I and the audience all heard sounds that were interpreted as sex. And when the image came, it became clear that it was actually death. The film created an experience in my body, subverting the expectations of my mind, and that is the erotics of art. That is what Emerald Fennell made, and she was intentional in doing so. I watched about 3 or 4 of her interviews to be sure I understood her vision as well as I could before talking about it publicly. And the entire discourse responded with hermeneutics, with interpretation and prosecution, with arguments about what the film should have been instead of descriptions or appreciation of what it was. I saw all of the discourse before the film, and it did inform my preconceived notions walking in there that day. Every woman who has ever made something that uses the film medium to communicate thoughts and feelings visually and sensually has faced the same response. It gets dismissed as lacking depth. To the women watching this video who feel almost afraid to speak on art, much less create it, for fear of being told it wasn't intellectual enough, Hopefully this helps you see it from a different perspective. There is no document where Emily Bronte explains what she meant. She published under a male pseudonym, Ellis Bell, and died at 30. We have diary entries, poems, these little fragments, but no author's commentary on Wuthering Heights. Because of this, every reading of the novel is an interpretation. Consider the 1939 Olivier film and Andrea Arnold's 2011 film. Even every PhD thesis represents a different view. Fennell herself noted that the novel changes depending on the time of day that you read it. So when critics say that she misreads the book, they really mean her reading differs from theirs, and they believe that theirs is right. But on what authority? Hutchin called the adapted text a reservoir of instructions that the adapter can use or ignore. In Madwoman in the Attic, Gilbert and Gubar argued that authorship has been coded as masculine for centuries. The pen is a metaphorical penis. The writer fathers the text. When a woman picks up the pen, she faces what they call the anxiety of authorship, the inherited fear that she has no right to create. Whatever she imagines is seen as illegitimate because it comes from her. When the Letterboxd reviewer says Fennell wildly misread this novel as a swoony teenager, there's a real argument in there. The novel is more than a love story. But what I want you to notice is the language. Instead of maybe she interpreted it differently, the language is swoony and teenager. The critique slides from what she got wrong to who she was when she felt it, as though a 14-year-old girl's encounter with this book cannot be a legitimate origin for art. That slippage is what Gilbert and Gubar spent 400 pages explaining. While the criticism may be valid, the contempt is an inherited way of thinking about what serious art is. I need to be clear that Fennell is not the Brontes. She attended Oxford, married into wealth, and had an $80 million budget and an Oscar before even beginning work on this adaptation. The barriers that Gilbert and Gubar describe don't really apply to her circumstances, but the critical response follows the same pattern regardless of all of her advantages. So this pattern persists even when the woman has resources and connections, highlighting that this is a structural flaw, not circumstantial. Would my version of Wuthering Heights have been Fennell's? No. I grew up mixed race in a small, predominantly white town in the Deep South. I was called names and teased for my curly hair and treated in a way that made me feel that I didn't quite belong to either group. So because of this, Heathcliff's experience as an outsider was something that I could deeply connect to. A couple of the key differences that I would have made is I would have cast Heathcliff as a person of color. I wouldn't have had Heathcliff and Cathy ever kiss, let alone have sex, because the most romantic moment in the novel for me is Heathcliff having Cathy's grave dug up, because I felt that as a moment of raw turmoil and unquenched passion. As you can see already, my version would have been profoundly different from Fennell's, but I still appreciated her interpretation for what it was, because I don't have the same connections in my brain that she does in hers that inform her artistic choices and inspiration. Every adaptation is a non-identical double of its source. It may carry the original's DNA, but it expresses different traits. To be totally transparent, I should tell you that I walked into that theater expecting to hate it. This was a film that had dared to market a novel I had cherished since I was a young girl in a way that I did not agree with. When I read Wuthering Heights, it was the first time that I felt that there was another imagination out there as wild as mine, that had endured suffering, that found beauty in unlikely places. And I connected with Emily as someone who felt everything extremely viscerally. So for this to have been marketed with the tag, "the greatest love story of all time," made me come to the conclusion that Emerald Fennell hadn't made what was really there, but she had only made what she thought the current culture wanted to see. When I walked out after it was over, there was a storm coming in off of the English Channel, and the mist was draping itself over the turrets of the city around me. I felt like I was in the novel, and something happened to me that I don't think has ever happened before. I began to cry and laugh at the same time, like I was sobbing in the middle of the street, and I'm a person who contains my emotions in public because of my anxiety. This film had done something strange to me that no other ever really had, and I couldn't separate what I felt from what I thought. Did I love it? Did I hate it? And I wasn't sure it mattered anymore because everything that I had felt was so overwhelming in that moment, and I knew that it had moved me. The accusation of butchering Bronte's work presumes that the novel is the sacred fixed object that cannot be profaned. But Wuthering Heights was not received as sacred when it was published. It was considered coarse and brutal and morally repugnant. Emily Bronte refused to make moral judgments because she was a radically amoral person in her artistic choices. So instead of being book religious about Wuthering Heights, why not look at what the novel physically does to the reader? If you've read the book, you've probably felt like you are being consumed by something very raw and incredibly human. There is a reason why most people come away from reading the novel as viewing Heathcliff as this romantic, Byronic hero. And it's because the love tangles the themes of love and violence so brilliantly that it's sometimes impossible to separate them. And to be honest, it informed my idea of what love looked like before my frontal lobe fully developed, which is probably why I have been so historically terrible at choosing men. Fennell said, "I can't adapt the book as it is, but I can make an approximation of how it made me feel when I was a teenager. Make you physically react. That's what I want to do." She was trying to reproduce what the novel does. Fennell cut back the content of the novel, like the second generation book and Hindley and some of the more complex political dimensions of it, so that she could use those 2 hours of screen time to evoke the feeling in the audience that the novel had without it being buried under some of the more complex parts of the plot. You can disagree with what she cut, I do, but the aim was to make the experience of the novel more real to the viewer, not to explain what the novel means. That is an adaptation that we have never had before. Criticism has value, but this is a reminder of asymmetry. Fennell spent years possessed by this novel. She built a film from the inside of her own obsession and put it in front of the world, knowing it would probably be torn apart. The truth is, every critic who calls her work empty or blasphemous is operating from the safety of reaction. The creative act, making something from nothing, is categorically different from judging it. Both have value, but only one requires you to be vulnerable because only one can fail. Amalia Ullmann is an artist and filmmaker whose work I deeply admire. She broke the internet in 2014 with Excellences and Perfections, which was an Instagram performance piece about beauty routines and plastic surgery that turned out to be entirely fabricated, designed to expose how social media frames women as objects to be looked at. She entered the art world very young. In a recent interview, she said that she was abused both financially and physically and lacked mentorship and guidance. Just older men moving her around in galleries thinking that she might be a money cow. She said that she felt hyper-exposed and then abandoned once she didn't repeat her breakthrough. She quit all of her galleries last year and moved to film, where for the first time she found mentors, collaborators, and people who rooted for her instead of purely extracting from her. That story is the unfortunate current reality of what happens to women in creative industries. You are celebrated for the thing that you made, and then you are punished for not making it again, or for making something different, or for making something that doesn't serve the people who profited from you in the first place. That massive exposure comes without protection, and the willingness to keep making things despite that, and despite the exposure, and despite the abandonment and the discourse that converts your work into content for other people's takes is a battle. Every woman who makes something and puts it out there despite the cost makes it more difficult for the next woman to be dismissed. In 1976, Ellen Moore's published Literary Woman, the first major work to treat women's writing as a coherent tradition with its own forms and lineage. Moore's asked, what did it matter that so many of the great writers in modern times have been women? Her answer was, everything. She coined the term Female Gothic, and her insight is about what Gothic does. It aims to get the body itself, the glands, muscles, epidermis, and circulatory system quickly arousing and quickly allaying the physiological reactions to fear. It's about the flesh. When critics say that Fennell's film is all sensation and no substance, they are making the mistake Moore's warned against 50 years ago by dismissing the body as less important than the mind. In the Female Gothic, the body is the argument. It always has been, ever since the genre existed. Women writers from Anne Radcliffe to Mary Shelley and Emily Bronte to Christina Rossetti were told that they were being excessive, and they created anyways, which set the path for women today. Claire Johnston argued in the 70s that feminist cinema needed a strategy that embraced a film as both a political tool and entertainment, that for too long these had been treating as opposing poles with no common ground. Fennell's film is exactly that common ground, a blockbuster that is also a performance art piece about the female body. The reason the discourse cannot agree on what this film is might be because both things are true at once. Moore's most famous argument is Frankenstein read as a birth myth. Mary Shelley was pregnant at 16 and almost constantly pregnant for the following 5 years, yet rarely a secure mother because she lost most of her babies soon after they were born. Her first baby died unnamed. Her journal entry was, "Dream that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived. Awake and find no baby." The Female Gothic is about the female body's most extreme experiences: pregnancy, labor, loss, the creation of life that is also the risk of death. The most famous Gothic novel ever written was by a woman and was literally born from the experience of her body. Fennell's insistence on making a film that works through the body is actually the tradition's purest expression. The dining room walls at Thrushcross Grange are sweating. There are hundreds of these small plastic half-spheres arranged in a Regency-style pattern, perfectly symmetrical and designed to look like condensation. The production designer, Susie Davies, calls it Posh Moisture. And I've been thinking about that phrase because it's kind of the whole film, isn't it? The feeling of something exquisite and something biological happening at the same time on the same surface. The black tiles at Wuthering Heights are high gloss, so the floors feel wet and sweaty even when they're dry. The rocks in the parlor are pushing through the plaster, and they push further as the story goes on, like the earth is swallowing the house back into itself. Mold crawls and spreads onto the walls like a skin disease. There's the chandelier that's hanging what looks like it's an umbilical cord. There are so many little details, down to the scratches on the doors and the stews of sheep's tongue on the kitchen table. And everything drips. Susie Davies said that she wanted every surface to have some sort of movement. She wanted the walls to breathe and feel alive and not just flat. Something cool about the experience of this film is that you can almost smell it because there is so much texture and moisture and visuals all at once, stimulating the senses. Like with the rancid farmyard, you feel this like wet wool, and when the pig is slaughtered, you can smell the blood, and the dampness of the house, there's like hot breath on the windows, and it kind of made my eyes water, like that uncomfortable feeling, like, yeah. So I don't really know how to explain to you what it feels like to sit there and have like your own skin respond to what you're seeing on a screen. but that's what happened. And one of my favorite designs was the food on the dining table in Thrushcross Grange. It looked like art, and it was there for aesthetic, to be looked at and not consumed, which is, when you think about it, exactly what they do to Kathy. All of the films and literature that I love are created by women. The fact that Gothic tries to get the body to have that physiological response is in itself somatic. That's what I love about Gothic films and Gothic literature. It makes you aware of yourself as this person, this living being with a circulatory system that doesn't just function, but it feels. The lineage of female authors like Emily Bronte and Sylvia Plath, these women made something that the public viewed as weird, as monstrous. They were told that they were too imaginative, and they kept writing anyways, thank goodness. Fennell in an interview said that she wanted the film to be visceral and physical. She wanted tactile stuff, like you have dough and eggs, and she wanted the people watching it to cry and to feel aroused and disgusted. She hoped that movies could be physically moving as well as emotionally moving. What she was describing is literally the female Gothic tradition that we have been speaking about. And here's what is so interesting about this to me. When one of the most popular Letterboxd reviews calls the film "What Happens When You Let People Who Were Born to Make Aesthetic Pinterest Boards Direct Movies," there is a Victorian version of that sentence. The Athenaeum's 1847 review of Wuthering Heights dismissed it as the eccentricities of a woman's fantasy. 179 years apart, the vocabulary slightly changes, but the meaning doesn't. Susie Davies built both houses on one soundstage, and the thing that gets me is how differently they relate to a body standing inside of them. At Wuthering Heights, the ceilings were so low that Jacob Elordi, who is, I think, 6'5", has to duck his head. He literally cannot stand upright in this house that he grew up in. This furthers the narrative of the outsider through the design of the environment. And with the land squeezing into the buildings and the rocks pushing through the walls, they push further and further, like the moor is reclaiming what belongs to it. One detail I really appreciated is how everything is odd numbers and off-kilter. The stable has these Gothic arches with growths on them that look like tumors. Heathcliff's bedroom has these slits in the floorboards so that you can see whatever's happening down below, as I'm sure if you've seen the film, you remember that particular scene. The tiles are laid to give this diamond checkerboard pattern in the parlor with the red and the black and the white, and there's leather doors, which I found an incredibly cool detail. Davies says that she wanted the set to make the actors inhabit the spaces subconsciously, and I think that was a really smart thing to do. In Kathy's room, there are these morbid children's toys in the form of hanging dolls that were historically bought on Hanging Day. And there is this doom painting of the 7 deadly sins in the parlor that crept into the edges of the scenes there. All of these dark little details. And then Thrushcross Grange. Everything looks quite extravagant, but there's always something unnatural and maybe like uncanny about it. There is this grand staircase with red fur on the underside of it, and there are these tall, narrow portrait-style windows, as opposed to Wuthering Heights, where the windows are these little small diamond shapes, and they're crooked and small. On the set, every sash window actually really opened, and they used a 360-degree photograph of the actual filming location as a backdrop. And they created these little pockets of weather in certain areas so that they could control what the actors saw when they looked outside. And of course, your environment is going to affect your mood and your acting. I thought that they were actually on location because there is nature visible from every window that looks real, and yet it was completely managed. There is this swing outside in the garden in Thrushcross Grange that was inspired by Fragonard's painting of this aristocratic lady swinging carefree with her lover hidden away in the brush, so that little detail was intentional as well. The ethos behind the design in the Heights is that everything that lives is wild, and in the Grange, everything that is living is caged. Even the flowers are tightly pressed, and I remember there was this stuffed lamb that was also in the glass, this innocent lamb. And my favorite detail actually was in the garden. There were these goldfish in these big goldfish bowls. When talking to Architectural Digest, Davies explains this brutalist Wuthering Heights set with the landscape encroaching in, while the Grange is its opposite, almost reminiscent of Versailles, which is where I live, with everything symmetrical and under control, even numbers and sparkling and crystal and silk, and somehow just as suffocating. One house crushes you while the other one preserves you like a little pressed flower. Kathy lives in both, and neither one of those gives her the freedom that she's looking for. When Kathy marries Edgar Linton and moves to Thrushcross Grange, she is presented with a bedroom that was designed just for her. From first glance, the room looks like every pretty Regency bedroom that you've ever seen in a period drama. Dusty pink, padded panels, soft lighting. There is this bureau there. But as you get closer, it's more of a horror story. The walls are made from Margot Robbie's skin. The process behind it was so fascinating to me. They photographed the inside of her elbow where the veins stand out and printed these high-resolution images of her arm onto fabric and stretched it out, blew it up to 3 or 4 times its scale, and covered it in latex. And like wallpaper motifs, there are these moles and freckles and little veins and imperfections in the skin. There's even this stray hair that's sprouting out of a mole. The floors too, her veins are on the carpet. In the final overhead shot where Kathy is bleeding out when she's dying, you can see the veins beneath her on the rug. The reason behind the latex walls, so that was as Kathy's fever intensifies, the walls are able to start to sweat as the real skin is perspiring. Fennell said that all of the senses are going to get wound up in the film, and the skin room definitely does that. She called it a visual representation of what it feels like to be made a wife. The room is her. She sleeps inside of her own body that her husband built like a cage shaped like her. It's padded and it's lined with her. And when Heathcliff visits and starts touching and licking the walls, he's actually tasting her skin. And when she puts her hands against the walls and like drags them down, she's touching herself and her own entrapment simultaneously because her body is made the decorative prison. In The Madwoman in the Attic, Gilbert and Goubart described a concept that they call killed into art. The angel in the house doesn't just live in the house. She becomes the house. She becomes the decor and the architecture. She becomes this aesthetic object that someone else inhabits. One of the most memorable visuals to me was the title card at the beginning of the film. If you haven't seen it yet, it was Wuthering Heights, in quotation marks, spelled out in these braided ropes of hair woven together across a miniature Yorkshire landscape. The hair in the sequence included the actual hair of Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi. It intertwines the two main characters together before the story even begins. There was this Victorian practice of mourning jewelry, where they would weave bracelets and brooches from the hair of the dead because hair doesn't decay, it can actually survive for centuries. Charlotte Bronte owned a hair bracelet made from the hair of her dead sisters, Emily and Anne, and Margot Robbie wore a replica of it on the press tour. In the novel, Heathcliff opens Catherine's coffin and finds her hair intact. It was the one part of her body that hadn't decomposed. He pulls out Edgar's lock of hair and replaces it with his own. A woman makes something bodily and perverse and excessive and truly Gothic and makes a room out of her actress's skin, a title card from her real hair, and makes the dining room sweat and the floors bleed and the chandelier hang from an umbilical cord that connects to the body of the house. And then the response is, but where is the substance? The substance is the skin on the walls. The substance is the veins on the carpet. Moore states that the puzzles of Wuthering Heights may be best resolved if the novel is read as a statement of a very serious kind about a girl's childhood and an adult woman's tragic yearning to return to it. Catherine's love for Heathcliff is rooted in childhood, how children know each other before the social world imposes its categories. Emily Bronte's view of childhood was comprised of nature and freedom, but not innocence. The childhood she writes about is savage. When Catherine is wrenched into the genteel world of Thrushcross Grange, she loses a specific mode of being in the world that is wild, physical, and uncivilized. The moors are not only this pretty backdrop, but they're the thing itself and the most important character in the novel, if you ask me. There is this part in the novel when Kathy is describing a dream that she had where she was in heaven and she wanted to return to earth, and the angels were so angry that they threw her down out of heaven. And heaven is Thrushcross Grange, and earth, the place where she shouldn't want to be, is Wuthering Heights. If the novel is about a girl's childhood and the yearning to return to it, then Fennell, who read it at 14, at the exact threshold between childhood and adulthood, was the novel's ideal reader. She was feeling that loss that the novel describes at the moment of that loss. This explains something I have never heard anyone else explain, which is why this novel gets adapted so obsessively. Other novels of its type and era, like Jane Eyre and Middlemarch, get adapted occasionally, but Wuthering Heights has been adapted dozens upon dozens of times. I think like almost 40 times it's been adapted. And I feel like that's because nobody that reads it comes away with the same book. It sustains every interpretive reading, but still resolves none of them. Like, there is evidence for every interpretation that I've seen in the novel, but no interpretation has been able to capture everything in the novel. Bronte gave us a novel with no explanation behind it, and I think that is the source of its power. Every filmmaker who picks up this material is convinced that their reading will finally capture it, and have had to come to terms with the fact that there's always something left over. And I think that's its genius. Fennell's film is the latest attempt, and it will not be the last. I'll see you in theaters in 2035 with mine. Kidding, maybe. In the novel, Heathcliff hangs Isabella's dog on the night of their elopement, a rehearsal for what he would later do to Isabella herself. Fennell removes the dog's strangulation, and in its place, Isabella absorbs the dog's function. I've seen people call Isabella's portrayal as funny and a submissive punchline, and they are reproducing one of the oldest failures of domestic violence discourse, which is that a victim who stays lacks agency. I have lived in abusive situations. I was not unconscious of my situation. Many women become complicit in their own abuse as a survival mechanism. The knowledge of what is happening to you is the horror, and everything gets quite blurred and confusing. Your reality is distorted. Fennell said something that pretty much validated how I felt. She said, "I always felt more like Isabella than Kathy, hoping to get seconds at the disco. We want to stick our fingers in the socket. There is pleasure in the horror." The filmmaker accused of mocking Isabella is telling you, I am Isabella. The last scene that we see of Isabella is her crying and begging not to be taken away from the place of her own captivity. That was the most haunting scene in the film. A 2024 in PLOS ONE analyzed over 700,000 sentences of film criticism and found that films led by women received 149% more hostile sexism in professional reviews. And there is this particular word that keeps appearing in criticism of women's films: surface. When Marie Antoinette came out in 2006, the critics called it cinematic pastry, a cream puff of delicious air but lacking in meaty substance. Notice how substance is defined by what it is not. Substance is not decorative, nor is it feminine. 20 years later, Fennell gets the same accusation in a merely updated vocabulary of a Pinterest board Gothic perfume advert that is beautiful but empty. The assumption underneath both is that a visually rich surface is evidence of absence, that beauty is what you resort to when you have nothing to say, that the image, especially the decorative image, is seductive and beguiling and ultimately false. But the women who work through visual surfaces know that the greatest form of depth that you can reach in the medium of films is through the visuals. Mood and form are not a substitute for substance in women's cinema. They are the substance. Hutton explains the double standard with one concept: the perceived direction of cultural movement. An adaptation perceived as elevating its source is praised, and one perceived as lowering it is punished. Del Toro's Frankenstein was viewed as moving the original story upward by creating this prestigious piece of cinematic art, while almost on the same breath, Fennell's Wuthering Heights was viewed as dragging Bronte down. Both films adapt Gothic source material written by women in the 1800s, and both did receive mixed reviews, but the tone was weirdly different. Del Toro's negative reviews question his choices, while Fennell's negative reviews question her right to make those choices at all, which is evidence of the gender distinction. There's an accusation underneath the criticism that I want to talk about, and that is the assumption that Fennell made something commercial for consumption rather than for contemplation. But Shakespeare chose plays based on familiar stories for commercial reasons. Verdi and Wagner were deeply involved in the financial aspects of their operas. But when a 21st century woman filmmaker adapts a novel into a blockbuster, it's exploitation. The museum has always been the marketplace. That's just how art has been able to survive. If you walk into any museum gift shop, which is unequivocally one of my favorite places in the world, it kind of proves the point. There's art for sale. Most artists have always had to depend on either an inherited privilege or marketing or connections in order to sustain that art and to survive. I want to talk about what Fennell chose not to include, because what's absent matters and alters the story. According to Sanger's chronology, Earnshaw walks to Liverpool in 1771. By that date, Liverpool merchants were responsible for over 84% of the British transatlantic slave trade. And 1771 is the exact year of the Somerset case, in which slavery was ruled so odious that nothing could be suffered to support it. Contrary to popular thought, the Brontes were not isolated recluses. Patrick Bronte actually owed his Cambridge education partly to a grant from Wilberforce, who was the parliamentary leader of the abolition campaign. The family subscribed to the Leeds Mercury, which covered slavery debates, and Yorkshire itself was entangled with Caribbean slavery because local families had made their fortune from it. Fennell told Vogue that there is a huge amount of discourse and scholarship about that precise thing. I take it enormously seriously. I wanted to make a story about a very complicated sadomasochistic love affair, and that was the thing I could do. The political dynamics of this story, I was not in the best position to be the person to tell that story. That is a legitimate artistic decision, and it is still a loss. Both of those things are true. While I would have made a different choice, I still found something in her version that moved me, and I'm not going to collapse that contradiction by picking a side, because that would be the easier and less honest thing to do. This is such a funny coincidence. My neighbor is currently playing a piece by Mozart that, if you've watched the 1939 adaptation of Wuthering Heights, that's the same song that is played in the piano at the party at Thrushcross Grange. So if you can hear it, we have some nice background noise. If you can't, I just find it a very funny coincidence. One last thing that I want to address is the infamous quotation marks. A common pattern in women's creation is the strategy of duplicity, which is submerged meanings hidden within more accessible public content. Anne Bronte signed her paintings with false initials. Charlotte published as Currer Bell, Emily as Ellis Bell. Even Jo March in the fictional Little Woman signed as Joseph March. That is every woman writer's cover story. Fennell's quotation marks are the strategy of duplicity. They claim and they disclaim in the same breath. They communicate that this is like my version of the film, and I know that you won't let me have that. And even though she told you in the title that this was her version, and the critics heard her say that in every interview, she was still attacked for it anyways. And people are saying things like the quotation did some heavy weightlifting. And it did not protect her at all. Just as Charlotte's pseudonym did not protect her, nor Emily's protect her, the world finds out that a woman made the creation, and then it decides that that creation was wrong for this, that, and the other. And I kind of think that as a woman, you just have to own it, because you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. So just make the thing that you want, and every time you do, the room gets a little bit bigger for another woman behind you to come in. And then there is Nelly Dean, the narrator, the housekeeper, the woman that everybody in that novel trusts, and probably no one should. Gilbert and Gubar in The Mad Woman in the Attic read Nelly as patriarchy's paradigmatic housekeeper, the man's woman hired to keep men's houses in order by straightening out their parlors and their daughters and their stories. Catherine's mad accusation that Nelly is a witch is insightful, actually, and not so much insane. Charlotte Bronte wrote the English novel's first deliberately feminist critique of Milton. Milton did not see Eve. It was his cook that he saw. Nelly is Milton's cook, the voice that transforms raw nature into this digestible, patriarchally acceptable narrative. This is the original faithful adaptation. And every critic who tells you that the story should be darker or more faithful or more serious, they tell that from the safety behind typing in their letterbox review, or behind the screen of the YouTube video, or the comment section, or the podcast take. And that's precisely what Nelly does. They are domesticating the story and making it safe for Lockwood, who is the outsider and the tourist, the one who just wanders in the middle of everything and asks to be told what happened. Since the film's release, sales of Bronte's novel have increased by 469% in the UK. Whatever you think of what Fennell made, she sent people back to the book that otherwise they may never have picked up. And maybe that's what the best adaptations do. I know that a year ago, if I was talking about Wuthering Heights to some of my friends, they maybe would have heard about it or read it once in high school, but couldn't really have much of a conversation. Now that's completely changed. Fennell made a blockbuster film, and the rest of us are Nelly Dean, telling the story from the safety of our kitchen. If you like feminine Gothic horror stories and you care about women's documentation, I write precisely about that on my Substack, Dead Girl Department.